Your dog doesn't just get excited when you come home. What happens in those first 30 seconds is a measurable neurological event. The nails on the floor, the tail spinning too fast, the full body reaction the moment you walk through the door. Most people think their dog is just happy to see them. And that's true. But it turns out to be wildly incomplete. What researchers found is that in those first 30 seconds, your dog's brain is running something closer to an ancient recognition program. There is a measurable hormone cascade firing inside your dog the moment you arrive. And most owners have never heard about it. What's actually happening the moment your dog hears your key in the lock? It starts before you even open the door. Before they see you. Before any visual contact at all. Dogs have a sense of smell roughly 40 times more powerful than ours. They don't just smell you. They smell the specific chemical signature you leave behind every single time you've ever come home before. That scent, your scent, is already triggering a response in your dog's limbic system before the door opens. The limbic system is the part of the brain that handles emotion, memory, and threat detection. When your dog smells you, that system doesn't flag it as neutral. It flags it as safe, as known, as good. Researchers at the University of Helsinki measured cortisol levels in dogs throughout the day. Cortisol is the stress hormone. What they found was striking. When the owner arrived home after 2 or more hours away, cortisol dropped measurably within minutes. Not gradually. Not slowly. It dropped the way it drops when a threat is removed. When something finally feels okay again. When the same experiment was run with a stranger entering the home, cortisol did the opposite. It spiked. The dog's body was reading those 2 arrivals as completely different biological events. Not just different moods, different threats. And here's the part most people don't think about. Your dog starts this process before you're even visible. They hear the rhythm of your footsteps, the specific pattern of how you walk. Some dogs recognize the sound of your car engine. A study out of Austria found that dogs would position themselves near the door significantly before their owner arrived, but not for strangers. They were anticipating, not reacting. There's a difference, and it matters more than it sounds. Anticipation means your dog has built a mental model of you, a prediction of when you'll be there. They've learned your schedule, your smell, your sound signature. And their nervous system responds to the prediction of you, not just your presence. So when the door finally opens and they launch themselves at you, that reaction has been building for a while. The spinning, the jumping, the high-pitched whine, that's not just excitement overflowing. That's a nervous system releasing a held state. Think of it like a compressed spring. The anticipation builds tension in their arousal system. Your arrival releases it. All at once. That's why it looks so out of control. Because neurologically, the brake just came off. And the system flooded. This also explains why some dogs seem to calm down faster than others after the initial burst. The ones who are more anxious during your absence have more built-up arousal to release. The calmer ones had less pressure in the system. Either way, what you're watching at the door isn't random behavior. It's a neurological sequence. Ordered, measurable, and specific to you. But here's what makes this even more interesting. The recognition your dog is doing isn't visual. It isn't even primarily about sound. It's chemical. Your body produces a unique combination of compounds, influenced by your diet, your stress levels, your health, your skin microbiome. That combination is as unique to you as a fingerprint, and your dog has memorized it without ever being taught to. So when scientists say your dog recognizes you, they mean it in the most literal, molecular sense of that word. Your dog wasn't waiting randomly near the door. They were running a biological countdown to the moment you arrived. Now think about what happens the moment actual contact begins. The door is open. Your dog reaches you. In those first 30 seconds of physical reunion, your dog's brain is running something researchers describe as a bonding cascade. It starts with oxytocin. You've probably heard of it. It's called the bonding hormone, or sometimes the love hormone. Oxytocin is the same neurochemical released when a mother holds her newborn for the first time. It is not a metaphor. A landmark 2015 study published in Science, led by researcher Miho Nagasawa, measured oxytocin in both dogs and their owners during interaction. They found that mutual gaze between a dog and their owner triggered a measurable oxytocin rise in both the human and the dog. The longer the gaze, the higher the oxytocin in both. It's a loop. Each one drives the other higher. But here's where it gets really interesting. The researchers ran the same experiment with wolves that had been raised by humans. Wolves who had grown up with people, who were socialized and comfortable around humans, who had strong bonds with their handlers. The oxytocin loop did not activate. The mutual gaze did not produce the same biochemical response in the wolves. This isn't about familiarity or training. It's something written into dogs over thousands of years of coevolution with humans. Now add dopamine to this picture. Dopamine is the brain's reward signal. It drives motivation, anticipation, and the feeling of pleasure. When your dog sees you, their dopamine system activates the same way it activates around something deeply desired and anticipated. Think of the way a human brain lights up when they're about to eat their favorite food, or see someone they've missed deeply. That's the class of response your dog is having. Not a mild positive signal, a significant reward activation. And then there's the physical side. The jumping, the spinning, the inability to stay still. That's the sympathetic nervous system. The arousal response. Adrenaline moving through the body. Heart rate up. Muscles primed. It's the same system that activates under excitement or mild stress. Your dog isn't choosing to jump on you. Their body is doing it the way your heart races before something big. It's involuntary. And that matters. Because it means the reaction isn't performance. It isn't trained behavior. It's physiology. Now, all three of these systems, oxytocin, dopamine, sympathetic arousal, are firing at roughly the same time in those first 30 seconds. That's what researchers mean by a cascade. It's not one thing happening. It's a sequence of interlocking biological events. Each one triggers the next. The smell activates the limbic system. The limbic system releases dopamine. Contact triggers oxytocin. And oxytocin, in turn, reduces cortisol further. The stress of your absence starts dissolving the moment you're physically there. Researchers have measured this transition in real time. Cortisol in dogs begins dropping within 2 to 3 minutes of first contact. By around 10 minutes after your return, most dogs have returned to baseline stress levels. As if you were never gone. The cascade resolves. The system resets. And what's left is just a dog lying next to you, calm, satisfied, completely okay. That entire sequence, from the first smell of you to the calm 10 minutes later, is what your dog's greeting actually is. Not just excitement. A neurochemical homecoming that both of you are participating in whether you realize it or not. It's been 15,000 years in the making. And it still happens at your front door every single day. Now picture the same dog. Same house. Same door. But it's not you walking in. A neighbor steps inside. A repair person. Someone your dog has seen a handful of times before, but doesn't truly know. The reaction looks completely different. And it's not just because your dog is being unfriendly. What's happening biologically is almost the mirror image of what happens when you arrive. Different systems, different chemicals, different outcome. When a stranger enters, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, activates first. Your dog is running an assessment, not a reunion. Cortisol doesn't drop. It holds or rises. The dog's body is not in release mode. It's in evaluation mode. Dopamine doesn't spike the same way either. There's no anticipatory reward signal firing. No, this is the thing I've been waiting for. The oxytocin loop, the mutual gaze bonding cycle, that simply doesn't get activated by someone the dog hasn't bonded with deeply. Researchers at Emory University used fMRI scanning to look at dog brain activity in response to different scents. They found that the caudate nucleus, a region heavily tied to reward and positive anticipation, showed significantly more activation for the owner's scent. Not just more than strangers, more than the scent of food. The owner's smell was the most positive signal in the dog's brain. That's not a warm and fuzzy metaphor. That's a measured difference in brain activation between two distinct sensory inputs. And it runs in both directions. When strangers arrive, the parts of the brain associated with caution and uncertainty become more active. The body stays slightly elevated. The system doesn't relax. There's no cascade of bonding hormones washing through. Your dog may be perfectly fine with strangers, friendly even. But fine and bonded are two completely different biological states. One is tolerance. The other is the thing your dog runs through every single time you open that door. Now, here's the part I want you to hold on to as we get to the end of this video. That greeting you get, the full body chaos at the front door, is not something your dog does for everyone. It's calibrated. It's selective. It's the result of a bond that took time, proximity, and thousands of micro moments to build. And because it's biological, it's also something that can shift. Not usually, not easily, but there are signals worth knowing. If a dog who used to greet you at the door starts staying back, starts skipping the reunion entirely, that is a signal. It doesn't necessarily mean they love you less, but it might mean something in their system has changed. Chronic stress can suppress the arousal response. So can physical pain. In older dogs, cognitive dysfunction can also affect it. A dog who used to launch themselves at you and now just glances up from the couch, that's worth a vet visit. Not because the love is gone, because the system that expresses it might be struggling. The greeting isn't just emotional, it's diagnostic. The way your dog meets you at the door reflects their overall state. Pay attention to it. It's one of the clearest signals your dog sends you every single day. Because the biochemical difference between how your dog greets you versus how they greet a stranger is not subtle. It is profound. You are the only arrival that triggers that full cascade. The recognition, the cortisol drop, the oxytocin loop, the dopamine reward. Every time, without exception, your dog's body is doing something for you that it does for no one else who walks through that door. So the next time you come home and your dog loses their mind at the door, that's not just excitement. That's a neurological event. A cascade of hormones. An ancient recognition system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The nails on the floor, the tail moving too fast. That's oxytocin and dopamine firing in a loop thousands of years old. It's not random. It's not habit. It's not your dog being clingy or needy or too much. It's biology saying, you came back. You came back, and everything in this body is responding to that fact. The cortisol that built during your absence, from the quiet house, the missing scent, the unresolved anticipation, starts falling the moment you're there. Your smell, your footstep pattern, your specific sound moving through their sensory system. These are not just familiar. They are regulating. Your presence literally calms your dog's nervous system at a chemical level, in a way that no other person in the room does. Now think about what that means. Not as a feel-good observation. As a biological fact, your dog has a full sensory map of you, stored in the part of their brain that handles safety and attachment. When you arrive, that map activates. The system recognizes you as something safe, wanted, and worth the full cascade. Not the stranger. Not the neighbor. Not even the person who feeds them when you're away. The data is specific. The reaction is specific. The biology at the door has your name on it to SO. The next time you stand at your door, key in hand, and hear the sound of paws on the other side, know that what's already happening in there is more than just a happy dog waiting to jump on you. Their cortisol is already dropping. Their dopamine is spiking. Their body knows you're home before you even open the door. That's 15,000 years of evolution saying, you are safe. You're home. You are the best thing that happened today. Before you go, I want you to sit with one more thought, because I think it changes the whole picture. Every day, your dog waits without knowing when you're coming back. No clock. No calendar. Just the held tension of your absence, and then you walk in. And every system in their body that was waiting releases. The stress dissolves. The reward fires. The recognition cascade runs from start to finish, the way it has run every single time before. That is not a routine. That is not them being dramatic. That is genuine neurological relief. The closest human equivalent researchers can describe is the feeling of arriving home after a long time away somewhere unfamiliar and stressful. The physical exhale. The drop in shoulders. The sense that now, finally, things are okay. Your dog gets that every time you walk through the door. Every single day. Because of you. Because it's you. The bond at the door isn't just love. It's biology. It's evolution. It's 15,000 years of two species choosing each other. If this changed how you see that moment at the door, subscribe to this channel and drop a comment below. Tell me how your dog reacts when you come home. I want to know. And if you want to understand what happens inside your dog's brain while you're gone, that video is next. What researchers found about how dogs process your absence and what they do while waiting is even more revealing than this.